The evening sun was slowly setting behind the tall buildings of New Avalon City. The streets were busy with people returning home after a long day. Among them walked an old man named Mr. Hanley. He wore a long brown coat, a flat cap, and carried a small leather bag. His face was calm, his eyes deep with wisdom, and his slow step steady. Many people passed him without paying attention. He looked like any ordinary elderly man. Mr. Hanley stopped near the city library. He liked to sit on the stone bench beside the fountain there. It was his favorite spot to rest and watch the people go by. The sound of the water always brought him peace. He had once been a man of great importance, but few knew that now. His simple clothes and quiet nature made him blend in easily. Two young officers, Paul and Mira, were patrolling the area. It was their first week on duty together. They had been told to watch for suspicious activity, since there had been reports of theft near the library. As they walked, Paul noticed Mr. Hanley sitting alone by the fountain. The old man's bag was beside him, and he seemed lost in thought. Paul whispered to Mira that the man might be waiting for someone or maybe loitering too long. Mira nodded, and they decided to approach him. They had no idea who he was. To them, he was just another citizen to check on. Paul stepped forward and greeted politely, asking Mr. Hanley what he was doing there. The old man looked up, smiled gently, and said he was resting after a walk. His voice was calm and polite, but Paul, still new to the job, thought his answer was too simple. He asked for identification. Mr. Hanley reached into his pocket slowly and handed him an old ID card. The card was slightly faded, but his name was clear: Henry Hanley. Paul looked at the card and frowned. It seemed old, maybe too old. Mira noticed the same thing. She asked if he had any new ID, but Mr. Hanley said softly that he had not updated it because he rarely needed to. He lived quietly now and preferred to stay out of attention. Paul thought the man might be hiding something. He had seen many cases where people used fake IDs. He asked Mr. Hanley to open his bag. Mr. Hanley hesitated, not because he was hiding anything, but because he was surprised by the sudden suspicion. He nodded politely and opened the bag. Inside were a few books, a notebook, and a pair of reading glasses. Mira felt unsure. Everything looked harmless, but Paul's training told him to stay alert. He called their station for a quick check on the name Henry Hanley. While waiting, he told the old man to stand up. Mr. Hanley obeyed slowly. He was old and his movements were careful. Paul asked more questions, like where he lived and what he was doing near the library every evening. Mr. Hanley answered truthfully that he lived nearby and liked the quiet place. But his calm answers only made Paul think he was hiding something clever. When the call came back, the station said there was no current record of a Henry Hanley in the system. Paul took that as confirmation of his suspicion. He decided to detain the man for questioning. Mira looked uncertain, but she followed protocol. Paul took out the cuffs and told Mr. Hanley he was being detained for loitering and possible false identification. The people passing by began to slow down and look. Mr. Hanley did not resist. He simply said, "Young man, you are making a mistake." His voice was soft but firm. Paul ignored it and gently but firmly cuffed his wrists. A small crowd started forming. Some people whispered, thinking the officers had caught a criminal. Others looked uncomfortable seeing an old man being led away. Mira noticed the sadness in Mr. Hanley's eyes. It was not fear, just disappointment. At the station, Paul filled out the report. Mr. Hanley sat quietly in a chair, still calm. Mira offered him water, which he accepted with a kind thank you. Paul entered the name again into the system, but there was still no match. He sighed and opened his tablet to search online. Maybe the name would bring something up there. When he typed Henry Hanley, the search results loaded slowly. Then the first headline appeared on the screen. Paul froze. It read, "Chief Justice Henry Hanley retires after 40 years of service." The article had a picture. It was the same old man sitting in front of him now. Paul felt his heart drop. He opened another link and saw more articles about the same man. He was once the highest judge in the Federation Court, respected across the colonies for his fairness and wisdom. Paul's face turned pale. He looked at Mira, who noticed his expression. He turned the screen toward her. She read it and gasped softly. Both officers stared at the calm old man sitting before them. He was not just anyone. He was the former Chief Justice of the entire planetary system, the man who had shaped the modern laws they were trained to follow. Paul quickly stood up, trembling a little. He unlocked the cuffs from Mr. Hanley's wrists and began to apologize. Mr. Hanley rubbed his wrists gently and looked at Paul with understanding eyes. He said there was no need to panic, that he understood they were only doing their duty. His voice was gentle, but his presence carried quiet authority. Mira said she was deeply sorry and offered to bring him tea or anything he needed. Mr. Hanley smiled and said he only wanted to go home. Paul could barely speak. He felt shame rise inside him. He had treated a man of great honor like a common suspect. He apologized again and again, but Mr. Hanley only said, "Young man, justice is not about who you arrest or release. It is about learning when you are wrong and having the courage to make it right." Those words struck deep in Paul's mind. He knew he would never forget them. Mr. Hanley stood up slowly. Before leaving, he looked back at them and said softly, "Remember, respect should not depend on who a person is, but on how you treat them." Then he walked out of the station into the quiet evening. After he left, the room was silent. Paul sat down and stared at his screen. He could still see the headline. Mira placed a hand on his shoulder and said they had learned something important that day. Paul nodded slowly. He had joined the force to protect people, but in his eagerness he had judged too quickly. Now he knew the weight of his actions. Outside, Mr. Hanley walked again toward his home, the same calm step as before. The city lights reflected on the wet street as night fell. He looked up at the sky and sighed quietly. He had spent his life teaching justice, and even now life continued to teach it in its own way. That night, the story spread quietly through the police network. By morning, every officer in New Avalon City knew what had happened. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but most felt a silent respect for the old man who had once been their highest judge and still carried the heart of justice. The next morning, New Avalon City Police Station buzzed with quiet whispers. Every officer had heard about the incident with Mr. Hanley. Some could not believe it was true, while others felt embarrassed that such a mistake could happen in their department. Paul sat at his desk staring at his report. The words looked heavy now. Every line reminded him of what he had done. He had followed the rules but had forgotten the respect behind them. Mira walked in holding 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of him and said gently that mistakes happen, but what matters is how people make them right. Paul nodded but said nothing. His mind kept replaying the old man's calm face and his words about justice. He had looked into those eyes and felt no anger, only wisdom. That was what hurt the most. Mr. Hanley had forgiven him so easily, but Paul could not forgive himself. Later that day, the chief of police called Paul and Mira to his office. The chief was an older man with gray hair and sharp eyes. He had also heard the news. When they entered, he looked at them seriously and asked what had happened. Paul explained everything from start to finish without hiding any detail. He admitted that he had made a poor decision and that he should have asked more questions before acting. Mira supported his explanation and said that Mr. Hanley had remained calm and kind during the whole event. The chief leaned back in his chair and sighed. He said the situation was serious but also a lesson. He told them that justice was not only about enforcing the law, but understanding people. Then he handed Paul a small file and said that Mr. Hanley had requested to meet them again. Paul was surprised. He thought the old man would never want to see them again. The chief said the meeting would be at the city library the next evening. Paul nodded, though his stomach tightened with nervousness. When evening came, the city lights flickered across the streets. Paul and Mira reached the library early. The fountain where they had first met Mr. Hanley still flowed gently, the sound of water calming their hearts. They waited quietly until they saw the old man walking toward them. He wore the same brown coat and carried his leather bag. His steps were slow but confident. Mr. Hanley greeted them warmly and asked them to sit with him by the fountain. Paul hesitated but followed. Mira smiled nervously and took a seat beside him. The old man looked at them and said he had asked for this meeting because he wanted to speak not as a former judge, but as an old man who cared about justice and those who serve it. He told them that during his years as Chief Justice, he had seen many good officers who lost their way because they focused only on catching criminals instead of understanding people. He said justice without compassion becomes cold and blind. Paul listened carefully. Every word felt like a stone lifted from his chest. Mr. Hanley said he did not blame them for what happened. He knew they were young and learning, but he wanted them to remember that true respect is shown most when no one is watching. Paul felt deeply moved. He told Mr. Hanley that he had spent the whole night thinking about his mistake. He said he had joined the police to protect people, but in his hurry to do what was right, he had forgotten to be kind. Mr. Hanley smiled softly and said that understanding this was already the beginning of wisdom. Then Mr. Hanley asked them a question. He said, "Do you know what the hardest part of justice is?" Paul and Mira looked at each other and shook their heads. Mr. Hanley answered, "It is not the law itself. It is the courage to admit when you are wrong, and the strength to forgive when others are wrong." His voice was calm, but his words felt powerful. After the talk, they walked with him to the corner of the street. Before leaving, Mr. Hanley invited them to visit the community center on Saturday. He said he would be speaking to young students about justice and peace. Paul promised to come. As the old man walked away, Mira said softly that he was one of the kindest men she had ever met. Paul agreed and said that they had met him by mistake, but learned more from him than from any training session. The next few days went by quietly. Paul returned to his regular duties, but something inside him had changed. He treated people differently now. When he stopped someone, he spoke with more patience. He listened more and judged less. The other officers noticed his change. Some teased him for being too gentle, but others respected his calm approach. Mira often reminded him of Mr. Hanley's words when the work got stressful. On Saturday, they both went to the community center as promised. It was a large building near the park, filled with young students who wanted to learn about law and justice. Mr. Hanley stood on the stage speaking to them. His voice was steady and his eyes bright. He told stories from his past cases, not about punishment, but about fairness. He said justice was like light. It must reach everyone equally, not just those in power. Paul and Mira sat quietly in the back, listening. When the session ended, the students clapped and many came forward to talk to him. Mr. Hanley smiled kindly at each one. When he saw Paul and Mira, he walked toward them. He thanked them for coming and asked if they had learned anything new this week. Paul said yes. He had learned that every person deserves respect no matter what. Mira added that she had learned how easily judgment can be wrong. Mr. Hanley nodded approvingly. Then he said something that surprised them both. He said he was starting a new program called Justice Through Understanding, a small community effort to build better trust between citizens and police. He invited them to help him run it. Paul was speechless for a moment. Mira smiled and said it would be an honor. They began working with him over the next few weeks. They helped organize meetings where police officers and local citizens sat together and talked openly. They listened to each other's fears and hopes. The program started small but grew quickly. Many people began to see the police not as enemies but as part of the same community. The officers also began to see the people they served in a new light. One evening, after another long session, Paul walked Mr. Hanley home. The streets were quiet, and the night breeze was cool. Paul asked him why he continued to do so much work even after retiring. Mr. Hanley smiled and said that retirement only means leaving an office, not leaving one's purpose. He said his purpose had always been to teach and guide, and as long as he was alive, he would keep doing that. When they reached his house, Mr. Hanley invited Paul in for tea. Inside, his home was filled with books and pictures of his past work. There were awards on the wall, but also simple drawings made by children from the community. It showed that he valued both wisdom and innocence. Paul looked around with admiration. He told Mr. Hanley that he wanted to live with the same grace and honesty someday. Mr. Hanley laughed softly and said that grace does not come with age. It comes with choice. That night, Paul left the house feeling peaceful. He looked up at the sky and thought about how much one man's kindness had changed his way of seeing the world. He promised himself that he would never forget this lesson and would pass it on to every young officer he met. The program continued to grow, and soon the name Justice Through Understanding became known throughout New Avalon City. People respected it not because of its title, but because of the heart behind it. And at the center of it all was Mr. Hanley, the old man who had once been misunderstood but now inspired an entire city. Weeks passed, and the city of New Avalon began to change slowly. The Justice Through Understanding program started by Mr. Hanley grew from a local effort into a citywide movement. Police officers began attending open talks, schools added short lessons about fairness, and even local news channels started covering their community meetings. People were surprised at how much peace could come from simple conversation. Paul and Mira had become two of the most active members of the program. Every weekend they helped organize workshops, answer questions, and talk about what they had learned from their experience with Mr. Hanley. They noticed that crime in their area began to drop, not because of stronger control, but because people started trusting the police more. One afternoon, Paul and Mira visited Mr. Hanley at his home to discuss new ideas. The small living room was filled with books, notes, and cups of tea. Mr. Hanley was sitting in his old armchair, reading a report from the community. His face looked peaceful, but his eyes showed that he was always thinking deeply. When he saw them, he smiled and asked them to sit down. Paul began explaining a plan for expanding their meetings to nearby cities. He said they could send recordings of their talks and invite other departments to join. Mira added that some local reporters wanted to interview Mr. Hanley again, but the old man shook his head gently and said he did not want attention. He said the goal was not fame, but understanding. If the people remembered the message, not the messenger, then the program would truly succeed. They talked for hours about different ideas, but then the doorbell rang. Paul opened the door, and a young woman entered. She introduced herself as Lena, a journalist from the New Avalon Daily. She had been following the program's progress and wanted to write a story about Mr. Hanley and the officers who worked with him. Mr. Hanley smiled politely, but said he preferred not to be in the spotlight. However, Lena said her article would help spread the message of peace even further. After a moment he agreed, but only if she focused on the lessons, not his past title. During the interview, Lena asked about the first incident at the library. She wanted to know how the misunderstanding had led to this change. Paul felt uneasy remembering that day, but Mr. Hanley spoke calmly. He said the event had been a blessing in disguise. Sometimes mistakes open doors that wisdom alone cannot. Lena wrote down his words carefully. A few days later, the article was published with the headline, "From Mistake to Movement." It told the story of how a single act of misunderstanding became the start of a new path for justice. The article became popular across the city, and soon messages of support arrived from nearby colonies. Other departments wanted to learn from them. But not everyone was happy. A few older officers and local politicians felt uncomfortable. They thought the program made the police look weak. They believed order came from control, not conversation. One of them, Captain Rourke, had been in the force for over 30 years. He was known for his strict discipline and his dislike for change. When he read the article, he called Paul and Mira to his office. When they entered, he sat behind his desk with a serious expression. He asked them if they thought the department needed lessons from an old retired man. Paul replied respectfully that they were not teaching the department, only trying to improve understanding. Rourke frowned and said, "Understanding does not catch criminals." Mira calmly explained that people cooperate more when they feel respected. Rourke dismissed them with a wave of his hand, but warned them not to let emotions replace duty. Outside the office, Mira sighed and said that some people would never change. Paul agreed, but said that progress always meets resistance. They decided not to argue further and focused on their work. The following week, Mr. Hanley was invited to speak at the City Hall. The mayor wanted to honor him for his contribution to peace and community trust. The hall was full of people, including officers, students, and local leaders. Paul and Mira sat near the front. When Mr. Hanley took the stage, everyone clapped warmly. He thanked them, but said the honor belonged to the people who chose to listen and learn. He spoke about justice again, saying it was not made in courts or stations but in hearts. He reminded them that laws can guide but only respect can heal, and his words touched many. Even some who had doubted him began to feel moved. After the speech, the mayor announced plans to include justice through understanding as part of the city's official training for officers. Later that evening, after the ceremony, Paul noticed Mr. Hanley coughing slightly. He asked if he was fine. The old man smiled and said he was just tired. Mira suggested taking him home, and he agreed. They walked him to his door, and before going inside, Mr. Hanley thanked them both for being the reason his message had reached so many. He said the program would continue to grow even when he was gone. His words worried them, but he only smiled again and went inside. A few days passed, and Mr. Hanley did not attend the usual meeting. Paul called, but got no answer. Mira decided they should visit him. When they arrived, the door was locked, but a neighbor said he had not been feeling well and had gone to the hospital. They rushed there quickly. At the hospital, they found Mr. Hanley sitting up in bed, weak but smiling. He said it was just exhaustion and nothing serious. Paul felt relieved, but the doctor quietly told them that the old man's heart was fragile. He needed rest and care. Mira asked if he would stop working for a while. Mr. Hanley said he would rest but could never stop sharing wisdom. Even from the hospital, he continued writing letters and notes for the community meetings. He asked Paul and Mira to lead the next event in his place. They agreed, though they were nervous. When the day came, the hall was full again, but this time Mr. Hanley's chair was empty. Paul stood on the stage and began to speak. He shared how they had met Mr. Hanley and how he had changed their lives. Mira added her story about learning patience and empathy. Their words carried the same strength that Mr. Hanley's always had. People listened with deep respect. At the end of the meeting, Paul read one of Mr. Hanley's messages. It said, "Justice begins not with power but with understanding. Every time we choose to listen, we bring peace one step closer." The audience clapped for a long time. After the meeting, they visited Mr. Hanley to tell him everything. He listened with joy and said they had spoken better than he ever could. Then he told them something important. He said that someday they must continue the program without him. He said they should remember that wisdom grows only when shared. As they left the hospital that night, Paul felt a strange heaviness in his heart. He realized that Mr. Hanley had become more than a mentor. He was like the spirit of justice itself, guiding them toward something greater. Mira walked beside him quietly, lost in thought. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and for the first time Paul understood that justice was not about titles or ranks. It was about human hearts learning to see each other clearly. The next morning, Paul received a call from the chief of police. The Federation Council had heard about their program and wanted to visit New Avalon to see it in action. It was the biggest recognition they could imagine. Paul and Mira were excited, but also nervous. They wanted Mr. Hanley to be there to witness it. They decided to visit him once more that evening and tell him the good news. The story of mistaken justice was about to reach a much larger world, and they knew it all began with one quiet man who had once been misunderstood by two young officers. The day was bright when the Federation Council's convoy arrived in New Avalon City. The streets were cleaner than usual, and banners of blue and white hung from the lampposts. Everyone was excited because this was the first time the council had come to review a local community project. Officers in uniform stood in neat lines while citizens gathered near the city hall to welcome the guests. The Justice Through Understanding program had become a symbol of pride for the city. Paul and Mira stood near the entrance of the hall, both wearing their polished badges. They had spent the entire week preparing for this day. The council members were known to be strict, and they wanted everything to go perfectly. But more than that, they wanted Mr. Hanley to be proud. They had visited him the night before to tell him about the visit. He had smiled softly and said that true justice was not shown through buildings or speeches, but through actions. Still, he promised he would try to attend if his health allowed it. When the council members entered the hall, cameras flashed and everyone clapped. The mayor greeted them and began his speech about the city's progress. After that, Paul and Mira were invited to the stage. Mira spoke first, explaining how the program had begun with one mistake that became a turning point. She spoke with simple but powerful words that touched everyone in the room. Paul followed, talking about how he had once misunderstood an innocent man and how that event had changed his heart forever. As they finished, the doors at the back of the hall opened quietly. A few heads turned, and then everyone saw Mr. Hanley walking slowly toward the front. He was using a cane now, but his posture was straight. His face looked pale, yet his eyes still held that calm strength that everyone respected. The crowd stood and clapped. Paul quickly stepped down and helped him to the front row. Mr. Hanley thanked him and sat down, smiling gently. The council leader, a tall woman named Counselor Nara, stood up to speak next. She said she had read about the program and had been deeply moved. She said that in a time when laws often divided people, this small city had shown a way to unite them. She praised Mr. Hanley for his wisdom and thanked the young officers for carrying his vision forward. Her speech ended with a promise that the Federation would support similar programs across other colonies. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded them, asking for comments. Paul and Mira tried to answer as best they could, but they noticed Mr. Hanley quietly leaving through the side door. They followed him outside. He was sitting on a bench under a tree looking at the sky. Paul asked if he was tired. Mr. Hanley smiled and said he was not tired, just thoughtful. He said seeing all those people reminded him of the early days when justice was only a dream in his mind. He then looked at Paul and Mira and said they had done something rare. They had turned a mistake into a movement. He told them that one day they must teach others just as he had taught them. Mira said she still felt unprepared to lead such a large mission. Mr. Hanley chuckled and said that true leadership is not about being ready but about caring deeply enough to try. The wind blew softly through the trees. For a moment they sat in silence. Then Mr. Hanley took out a small envelope from his coat and handed it to Paul. He said it was a letter meant to be opened only when he was gone. Paul looked worried, but the old man said it was nothing sad, only a message for the future. He then asked them to promise they would continue spreading the program, no matter what happened. They both promised without hesitation. The following days were busy. The council's report praised New Avalon City, and other colonies began asking for guidance. Paul and Mira traveled to nearby towns to help set up their own programs. They gave speeches, met new officers, and shared everything they had learned from Mr. Hanley. Every time they spoke, they used his words, his wisdom, and his spirit as their guide. One evening, while they were returning from a meeting in a nearby colony, Paul received a call from the hospital. The nurse said Mr. Hanley's condition had worsened. His heart was growing weak. Without a word, Paul started the vehicle and drove back to the city. Mira sat beside him, silent but tense. The road felt longer than ever. When they reached the hospital, the lights in Mr. Hanley's room were dim. He was lying quietly on the bed, his breathing slow but steady. When he saw them, he smiled faintly. Paul and Mira sat beside him. He said he was glad they had come. He told them not to be sad because every life ends, but what matters is what one leaves behind. He said they had already carried his dream further than he ever could. Paul held his hand and said that they could never thank him enough. Mr. Hanley said they already had by living the lesson he taught. He then asked Mira to bring his small notebook from the bedside table. It was filled with handwritten notes and ideas. He told them to use it to continue the program. His eyes looked peaceful as he said, "Justice must live beyond those who create it." Those were his last clear words before he slowly closed his eyes and rested. Paul and Mira sat silently, unable to speak. The nurse came in and covered the old man gently. The city lost its greatest teacher that night, but his lesson remained alive in the hearts of many. The next morning, the news spread through New Avalon. People filled the streets holding candles in his honor. Even officers who had once doubted him stood with bowed heads. The city decided to name the Central Library Park after him, calling it Hanley Square. During the ceremony, Paul gave a speech to the crowd. He said that Mr. Hanley had taught them that justice was not just about laws, but about humanity. He said every person has the power to bring peace by understanding one another. His voice was steady, but his heart was full of emotion. Mira then read a passage from Mr. Hanley's notebook, where he had written that respect is the foundation of all order. The crowd listened in silence, and many had tears in their eyes. After the ceremony, Paul finally opened the letter Mr. Hanley had given him. Inside was a single page with a short message written in neat handwriting. It said, "Dear Paul, remember that every mistake carries a hidden truth. Find it, learn from it, and share it. That is the real meaning of justice. Yours, Henry Hanley." Paul folded the letter carefully and placed it in his uniform pocket. He knew he would carry those words with him for the rest of his life. Months passed, but the program continued to grow. New Avalon became a model city for peace and cooperation. Officers from faraway colonies came to train under Paul and Mira. They built a training center near the library, calling it the Hanley Institute of Justice. Every new recruit learned about respect, empathy, and fairness before learning about weapons or patrols. Paul often visited Hanley Square in the evenings. He would sit by the fountain where it had all begun. Sometimes children played nearby, and sometimes young officers came to ask for advice. He always told them the same thing: listen before you judge, understand before you act. Those words became the motto of the new generation of lawkeepers. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall towers, Paul looked at the calm water in the fountain. The reflection of the sky reminded him of Mr. Hanley's quiet eyes. He smiled and whispered softly, saying that the lesson lives on and that the city had not forgotten him. In that moment, he knew that mistakes can indeed become miracles when hearts choose to learn from them. Years had passed since Mr. Hanley's peaceful passing. New Avalon City had changed in ways few could have imagined. The streets were brighter, cleaner, and filled with people who treated each other with a quiet respect. The Justice Through Understanding program had expanded beyond the city and had become a model for other colonies. Paul and Mira, now senior officers and mentors themselves, guided new recruits with patience and care. They always began each session by telling the story of the old man who had taught them the meaning of true justice. One morning, Paul walked through Hanley Square, the central fountain glistening under the rising sun. Children were playing nearby, and citizens passed by smiling at each other. Paul stopped for a moment and watched the water ripple. He remembered the first day he had met Mr. Hanley, how quickly he had judged and how deeply the old man had changed him. Mira joined him holding a folder with the day's training schedule. "Good morning," she said. "Are you ready for the new recruits?" Paul smiled. "Yes, but I wonder how much of what I say today will really stick." Mira laughed softly. "It will. You carry Hanley's lessons in your heart. That is enough for them to start learning." They entered the Hanley Institute of Justice. The halls were lined with pictures of Mr. Hanley, not only as a former Chief Justice but as a teacher, mentor, and friend. Every classroom carried his quotes about respect, understanding, and fairness. Paul and Mira entered the main hall where 30 new recruits waited, eager and nervous. Paul spoke first. "Today you will learn something more important than any law book," he said. "You will learn how to see people not as suspects or statistics but as human beings. Every action you take must come from understanding, not just duty. Let me tell you a story about someone who taught me this lesson." He told them the story of the first meeting with Mr. Hanley, how he had misunderstood an elderly man, and how that man had shown him the true meaning of justice. The recruits listened closely. Mira added her own perspective, explaining how empathy had helped her in difficult situations. Together, they described the early days of the program, how small conversations grew into citywide respect, and how communities had begun working together instead of against each other. A young recruit raised a hand. "Sir, how can we remember to stay calm when a situation feels tense?" Paul smiled. "That is what Mr. Hanley taught me. Breathe, listen, and ask questions. Always choose understanding before action. If you do this, even mistakes can become lessons." Mira added, "And remember, every person you meet is someone's child, parent, or friend. Respect them as you would want to be respected." After the session, Paul and Mira walked outside. The sunlight warmed the square and the fountain sparkled. Citizens nodded to them as they passed. Paul thought about how far the city had come. It was no longer just a place of buildings and streets, but a living community built on trust and fairness. Mira said softly, "I never thought one meeting could change so much." Paul agreed. It was not the meeting, it was the man. He planted a seed that grew with every choice we made. The following week, the Federation Council returned to New Avalon City for another review. This time, they wanted to see how the program had continued without Mr. Hanley present. Counselor Nara, the same leader who had visited years ago, met with Paul and Mira. She praised them for maintaining the spirit of the program and for inspiring others to follow the same path. She said that their city had become a symbol of hope and fairness across the colonies. During the visit, Paul and Mira guided the council through workshops and classes. They introduced young officers to techniques of communication, conflict resolution, and active listening. They showed how understanding could prevent mistakes, build trust, and strengthen communities. The council members were impressed and asked for advice to implement similar programs in other cities. After the formal tour, Paul found a quiet moment to visit the fountain at Hanley Square. He sat on the bench watching children play. He remembered Mr. Hanley's gentle voice and thoughtful eyes. He felt a sense of calm and responsibility at the same time. Mira joined him and handed him a cup of tea. "Do you think he would be proud?" she asked softly. Paul nodded. "I think he would. He taught us the lesson and we carried it forward. The city shows it every day." They sat in silence for a while, letting the water's gentle sound remind them of the first days of the program. That evening, the city held a small ceremony to honor the continued success of Justice Through Understanding. Families, officers, and students attended. Paul gave a speech, explaining that the work was never finished and that every person had the power to make a difference. Mira read from Mr. Hanley's notebook, sharing his simple words of wisdom. The audience clapped and many had tears in their eyes. Later, when the crowd had gone, Paul and Mira walked through the quiet streets. The city had lights reflecting on the glass buildings and the fountain glowed softly. Paul said, "I sometimes think about the first day I met him, how quickly I judged and how patient he was." Mira nodded. "He knew we could grow. That is the mark of a true teacher. He saw the potential before we did." Months turned into years. The program continued to grow, and young officers trained under Paul and Mira began leading their own initiatives in nearby colonies. Citizens started participating more, and trust between the community and police became a natural part of life. Whenever a new recruit asked how to handle a difficult situation, Paul and Mira told the story of Mr. Hanley, of understanding before judgment, of respect before action. One afternoon, Paul visited the hospital where Mr. Hanley had spent his last days. The building was quiet, but the staff remembered him fondly. Paul spoke to the current patients about the importance of respect and fairness. Even in a place filled with worry and illness, he noticed how small acts of kindness could bring comfort. He remembered Mr. Hanley's words, "Justice is a light. It grows stronger when shared." Back in the city, Mira organized a youth workshop. Children played role-playing games where they learned to negotiate, cooperate, and communicate without conflict. Parents watched proudly as their children practiced understanding, just as Mr. Hanley had taught. Mira thought about how one small mistake years ago had started a movement that touched so many lives. As the sun set over Hanley Square, Paul and Mira stood together, watching the fountain glow. They felt the presence of their mentor in every ripple of water, in every smile, and in every act of kindness they witnessed. The city had become a living example of his lessons. They knew that even though he was gone, his wisdom and guidance continued to shape every heart willing to listen. Paul turned to Mira and said, "I think he would be happy to see how far we've come." Mira nodded. "He would. And we must make sure the lesson continues for every generation to come." They held a quiet promise to carry his message forward, knowing that the legacy of understanding and respect was now part of the city itself. The city was alive with hope, trust, and cooperation. The fountain in Hanley Square reflected the stars above, a constant reminder that one person's wisdom could change countless lives. And every time someone chose to listen, to understand, and to act with care, Mr. Hanley's spirit lived on, guiding New Avalon City toward a future built on fairness, respect, and true justice.